Unit 31, Post-Structuralism and Postmodernism. Contents: 31.1 Introduction, 31.2 Critique of Structuralism, 31.3 Post-Structural Theories, 31.4 Discourse, Knowledge and Experience, 31.5 Derida and Deconstruction, 31.6 Foucalt and Archaeology of Knowledge, 31.7 Jameson and Late Capitalism, 31.8 Baudrillard and Postmodernism, 31.9 Conclusion, 31.10 Further Reading. Learning Objectives. After having read this unit, you should be able to outline post-structural theories, critique structuralism, describe deconstruction, explain late capitalism, discussion Baudrillard and postmodernism. 31.1 Introduction. It is the intellectual trend in the ontology of ideas and schools of ideas that they are constantly superseded. The ideas or ideologies that are superseded recede into the history of ideas. The new theories and ideas then occupy center stage in national and international sociological and social scientific worldviews. This cycle further repeats itself, and through this fact is often lost sight of in the heyday of a theoretical orientation that has become popular. In the essay that follows, we will first take up post-structuralism and then postmodernism theory. You will see how there are several overlaps, indeed intermeshes, between various strands of these two contemporary approaches to the study of society and culture. Thus, what we are dealing with are strands of an overall approach. There is no one view of these approaches, and both post-structuralism and postmodernism are blanket terms containing many strands of thought. Let us turn now to post-structuralism first. What does the term indicate? As is clear from the word post-structuralism, these approaches are those that came after structuralism. These theories and approaches sought to seek insight into society by critiquing and deconstructing social and cultural processes. The postmodernism break with structuralism was the fact that structuralism reduced everything into binary oppositions and the interrelations between them. The structuralists held they could analyze any phenomena with the help of their methodology. We must emphasize that post-structuralism is a number of approaches and not one monolithic theory. However, these approaches have in common their point of departure, a critique of structuralism. 31.2 Critique of Structuralism. Post-structuralists often point out in their various writings that meaning in language is diverse and open to many different interpretations. Yet to get to the meaning of a text, it can be reconstructed and is different from its apparent or surface meaning. That is, different meaning can be assigned to a single text depending upon the perspective taken. As would be clear by now that the post-structuralism proceeds as a critique of structuralism, which is itself bounded by its own linguistic boundaries. Structuralism, however, was found to be inadequate as an explanation of social process and phenomena. Thus, we find that structuralism did not pay heed to historical process and is a historical applied the rules of linguistics to societal process, which is a questionable procedure. It is assumed that a work has meaning in itself, and this persists even before it is discovered, and the text is only a conduit between the subject and the structure of rationality. Thus, the structuralists argue that it is language and its structure that which itself produces reality, and since it is language what is responsible for thought, it determines man's perceptions, whatever they may be. Further, there is the idea that meaning does not come from individuals, but the rules of language and the overall system which controls individuals. Therefore, the individuals is subordinated and superseded by the structure. It is the structure which produces meanings, not the individual. It is specifically language which is at the base of such domination over the individual. 31.3 Post-structural theories. As can be seen, post-structural theories do not agree with the structuralists in several key areas of analysis and understanding. We will now turn to this and see how the two differ. However, before that, let us look briefly at the background to post-structuralism. By the 1950s, the influence of structuralism had set in. Saussure 1859-1930 was of the view that meaning had to be found in the structure of the old language. It could not be discovered in individual words and had to have an overall linguistic setting, that is the language as a whole. We find that around the 1960s, the structuralist movement tried to amalgamate the ideas of Marx IV and Saussure. The structuralists were opposed to the existentialist movement, which put the individual and life experience at the center. By contrast, the structuralist opined that the individual is everywhere being conditioned by social, psychological and linguistic structures which control and direct him, rather than the individual doing the same. As you will have noticed, this is an extreme stand, and the claim for university of application of method also drew attention to the fact that such claims of universal application did not necessarily hold true. Also, how is it that any two structural analysis of the same field or phenomena would be different? It was because of the shortcomings of the structuralist approach that post-structuralism was developed by the intellectuals. This post-structuralism is based on a number of basic assumptions or positions. These include putting all phenomena under one explanation. There is a transcendental reality which overarch all other reality. Post-structuralism is also critical of the concept of man as portrayed and developed by Enlightenment thought. The Enlightenment view that the individual is separate and the whole, and that the mind is the area where values evolve on the other hand, and the post-structuralist felt that the individual was embedded in social interaction. Such symbolic beings are referred to by the word subject. We can then say that the subjects are intertwined with society and culture and occupy some place within them and sociologically based site. Further, subjects are the actors in everyday reality. In fact, it is the subject that make up society, and the activities therein include work and entertainment. We would add here that the subject's meaning and values are embedded in the identities of groups and the activities which lead them to having an identity. Thus, these approaches that we are discussing have often been dubbed anti-humanist because post-structuralism is against the divine or the transcendental allness, as was the humanist theory views. However, anti-humanist is a misnomer and is actually another way of looking at human being, one that is essentially not against individual persons. Further, we find that while structuralism presents reality as relations between binary opposition, post-structuralism vision on reality is a fragmented one. Social process and cultural relations are not viewed as neat positions. On the other hand, social and cultural processes are seen in bits and pieces, and the nature of reality is not seen as being amenable to total understanding of a whole process. Parts of social process can be focused upon and analyzed. Post-structuralists are completely opposed to grand natives and meta theory, feeling these are equivalent to fiction and not really apprehending reality. Thus, post-structural theories are themselves looking at the specific. Further, the physical self, if the body, is studied in the context of time and history and brought out of the clauses to speak. Similarly, it is the details of discourse and cultural actions that are now looked into. Further, the role of language is in building social and cultural reality, also evident in the work of the post-structuralists. Thus, the fact that the society and the individuals are linguistically bound and which each other, and the relationship between the two is complex. This state clearly negates the earlier assumptions of social scientists that language was easy to comprehend and use, and that are the that were no ambiguities regarding language use. This is the post-structural theories negate as an erroneous conception. In fact, reality itself is constructed within the social matrix and continues to reproduce itself over time. 31.4 Discourse, Knowledge and Experience. The world of discourse and knowledge set the limits for our experience and the subject. Ego can only be experienced or describe what he has experienced. That is to also say that there are experiences for which there is no language, or a language is slowly being pieced together, and certain words and concepts again ground and usage. This includes the usage of metaphor, metonymy and irony. These are just usages lead by themselves to a certain concern with ideology, which provides an ingress and insight into relations of power and the worldview of the subjects. Again, another area in which post-structural theories focus upon in their analysis on what are known as cultural codes, which themselves provides an understanding of our lives and how they work out within various contexts. However, it need to be pointed out that it is understood by the post-structuralists that constructions of meaning implies that some aspects of social process and individual life will be emphasized and others will be relatively reduced in importance. In other words, objectivity, as in the case of earlier sociological theory, is found to be an illusion. That is, the analysis of a post-structuralist does not deny subjective orientation. Yet, post-structuralists also hold that meaning in society can be deconstructed to open up new ideas and practices. However, such an exercise leads to an understanding of specific rather than general constructions. Thus, loops of meaning and process of construction reveals more about the specific scaffolding of the subject rather than an understanding of the whole. The world is mediated by discourse, language and ideology, all of which structure the experience of the subject. According to post-structural thinking, it is the text which is the repertoire of meaning, and there is no meaning outside the text. Thus, meaning resides in the text itself is taught, and understanding resides in social science and discourses in particular field of study. Again, almost paradoxically, every text exists only in relation to other texts. However, it needs to be pointed out that the man's ability to perceive reality is not at stake. Nonetheless, what we know of reality is known through various processes of discourses and symbols and language. Yet, it must be understood that the discourses itself is very variant in content. It is also a fact that the discourse is sometimes sketchy and abrupt. It originates through chance and disappears also through unspecified reasons. Thus, as according to Foucalt, there is no questions of predicting history through grand theories and meta-narratives. History is thus viewed by post-structuralists as happening by chance. Thus, in history, the twins, turns, plots, subplots, and important events and happenings cannot be pinned down. That is, it happens by chance. 31.5 Derrida and Deconstruction. This brief note on structuralism is important for our understanding of the process of deconstructions initiated by Derrida. The basics of this structuralism are posting of a center of power or influence which begins and ends all social processes. This could be mind or self or even God. All structures are composed of binary pairs or oppositions, one of which is more important than the other and often signed thus plus or minus. This could be good or evil, good, bad, good, God or man, and so on. Reflections and actions. 31.1 Discuss what is deconstructions. How did Derrida deconstruct structuralism? Thus, post-structuralism begin with the Derrida's critiques of structuralism, or rather it is the deconstructions of language, society and structure. The structuralist felt that man was chained to structures which controlled him. In contrast, however, Derrida feels that language can be reduced to writings which does not control the subjects. According to him, all instructions and structures are nothing but writings and incapable of controlling the individual. The structuralist saw order and stability in language, hence in all structures The post-structuralist, on the other hand, saw language as an essentially changing and quite unstable. This means that the language structures being itself in flux cannot create structures that constrain, retrain, or punish people, because language itself is disorderly and the underlying laws of language cannot be discovered. This is what is the process of deconstructions, which, as the term suggests, is a sort of conceptual dissection of the concept or process being studied. Derrida, who coined the term deconstructions, felt that logocentrism has dominated the Western countries. This was perceiving has mean that writing has always been suppressed, historically speaking. This has also mean that the freedom to analyze and think is taken away in a logocentric system. Derrida wants to dismantle this type of approach, and it sets writing free from repression. Under these circumstances, what takes place in the art form of traditional theatre is a representation of real life. Such a representation is extremely important, in fact, a controlled theological theatre. Box 13.1, the theological center. Derrida contrasts theatre of cruelty as against traditional theatre, which has a representational logic and renders traditional theatres as theological. Derrida writes, the stage is theological for as long as its structure, following the entirely of tradition, combodes the following elements. An other creator who, absent and from afar, is armed with a text and keeps watch over, assembles, regulates the time of or the meaning of representation. He left representations represent him through representatives, directors or actors, who represent the thought of the creator. Finally, the theological stage comports as passive, seated public, a public of separate spectators or consumers of enjoyers. Derrida chose alternative stage in one which will not be controlled by text and others but falls short of disorder or anarchy. Thus, Derrida wants a fundamental change in traditional theatre or life, which would mean a great change from the dominance of the writer, god, or the stage theatre, or in societal process as well leading closer towards freedom of the individual. Derrida feels thus that the traditional theatre needs to be deconstructed. In this mode of suggestion is included a critique of society itself, which is, as mentioned earlier, logocentric. Derrida feels that in the theatre it is the writer who puts together the script, and that this influence is so strong that it is akin to a dictatorship. Similarly, in social processes, the intellectual ideas and formulations are controlled by the intellectual authorities which create discourse. Further, we may add that post-structuralists believe in the process of decentering, because when this is no specific authoritarian pressures on society, it becomes open-ended and available for play and difference. This process is ongoing, reflexive and open. Thus, the present alone exists, and it is the arena where social activity takes place. Thus, we should try to find solutions by harking to the past. The future itself cannot be precisely predicted. However, there is no precise solutions that Derrida provides except that in the end there is only writing, acting and play which differs. At this point in our presentations, it would be instructive to look briefly at an example of post-structural ideas and ideology in the case of Michael Foucalt, one of the major post-structuralists. One critical difference between Foucalt and the structuralist is that while linguistics is the main influence from the former, it did not occur exclusively as the domain of ideas that have to be adopted or modified into post-structuralist schema. That is, post-structural thinkers use a variety of ideas and influences and are not reduced to examining the relations between binary terms. This variety of sources in presenting an argument is what plus Foucalt into the group of the post-structuralists. 31.6 Foucalt and the Archaeology of Knowledge. Foucalt describes his approach or methodology as the archaeology of knowledge. Use this approach, Foucalt studied knowledge and discourse. According to Foucalt, these approaches provide better ingress to understanding society, and it is different from history, which he feels is portrayed in a stereotyped linear progression, where the reality remains limited and continuous. Box 31.2, the Archaeology of Knowledge. In his early works of methodology, Foucalt 1960, according to an archaeology of knowledge, his objects of study are bodies of knowledge, ideas, modes of discourse. He contrasts his archaeology of knowledge to history and the history of ideas, both of which he regarded as being too rational and as seeing too much continuity in the history of knowledge. This highly structural approach in Foucault's early work was later abandoned for a post-structuralist orientation because it was silent on the issues of power as well as the link between knowledge and power. Michael Foucault died in 1984 at the age of 58 as a leading sociologist. Amongst Foucault's last works was a trilogy of sexual study. Their works indicated Foucault's interest in studying sexuality. These books were The History of Sexuality 1976, The Care of the Self 1984, and The Use of Pleasure 1984. Foucault, however, moved away from this structural type of analysis and began studying the genealogy of power. His concern was to find out the facts about governance through knowledge productions. The nature of knowledge as power should not be hierarchical, and also that the higher the knowledge, the greater the power it wields over the subjects. Thus, Foucault studies techniques and processes in science, since this is what exerts power over people through the medium of institutions. This is not to say that the elites are scheming and manipulating power. Again, Foucault uses a non-linear perceptions of progress in societies from the stage of barbarism to the present civilization. Thus, history is seen instead as shifting patterns of dominations. However, knowledge power is such that it is always opposed and resisted. Thus, Foucault's post-structural view is that while knowledge power are ubiquitous, they are certainly not omnipotent and later in their domination, but their power or authority is always questioned and opposed. A brief introduction to Foucault's idea would help us in completing that section on post-structuralism. Thus, according to Foucault, the mad have been misunderstood and mistreated over the course of history and subjected to moral control. Power and knowledge are implicative of each other. Technologies exerts power. Example, the panopticon, a prison with the cells around a large observation tower from which everything that inmates do is visible and observable. Such an institution is metaphoric of total societal controls of the prisoners, since it forces even the prisoners or inmates to exercise self-restraint. Thus, this is a direct relationship between technology, knowledge, and power. Thus, the panopticon is a prototype of societal control and surveillance, and the forerunner of intelligence services and satellite observation over geophysical territories. Postmodernism is not the term for a single type of theory, meta-narrative or grand theory. It is rather the term for an overall approach involving many similar strands. This is thus no single position in postmodernism, but all the thinkers in this approach share certain common features that separate it from modernism. This has been both of a feature that separates it from modernism, and the approaches all indicate that what they are doing is to present, dissect, construct ideas that will be relevant to the postmodern context. A large number of sociologists still tends to think that postmodernism is a passing fancy. However, it is not obvious that postmodernism cannot be ignored both as fact and phenomena. However, it cannot be denied that postmodernism is surrounded by diverse positions within the field itself. Reflections and Action 31.2. Outline the common features of postmodern writers. How are these separate from modernism? It would be proper at this point to distinguish between some common terms that are often confused with each other, although they are quite distinct from one another. Thus, the postmodernity is the word used for historical approach following the modern era. Further, modernism itself refers to cultural products which are different, separate from the modern cultural products in art, architecture, etc. Again, postmodern social theory refers to a method of ideating that differs from modern social theory. From the above, it can be said that the postmodern covers a new epoch, a new cultural products, new theories about society. Further, these new realities are getting strengthened, and this is a widespread feeling that the modern era is ending and being superseded by another epoch. This was evident in breaking up of buildings which are modern and complete. However, the postmodern theories themselves provide ready-made solutions in a general sense. However, it is questionable whether the birth of the postmodern era can be precisely dated, through it appears to have transited from the modern in the 1960s. Postmodernism indicates that in the cultural field, postmodern cultural products tends to replace modern products. Again, postmodern social theory has emerged from and has differences with modern social theory. Thus, postmodernism theory rejects the notion of foundationalism of the earlier theories, but itself tends to be relative, non-relational, and nihilistic. 31.7 Jameson and Later Capitalism. Again, the postmodern thinkers rejects the notion of a grand narrative or meta-narrative. For example, Lyotard contrasts modern knowledge, which has a grand synthesis. Example, the work of Parsons or Marx. Such narratives are associated with modern science. Thus, as Lyotard identify modern knowledge which meta-narratives, then obviously postmodern approaches demand that such theorizing should be negated in its completeness. This is because postmodern scholars such as Lyotard are not afraid to face the differences and challenges of such viewpoint. Thus, postmodernism becomes an instrument that welcomes different perspectives under the same broad umbrella. Let us now turn to look at some examples of postmodern theory. A good illustration of the postmodern theory is clearly set out in the work of Frederick Jameson. The point of departure is that modernity and postmodernity mark a radical break from each other and are hard to reconcile the two. However, a middle position is taken by Jameson, who writes that there are some continuities between the two epochs. According to Jameson, capitalism is in its late stages but continues to be the main form of productions the world over. However, this late stage of capitalism has been ushered in with postmodernism. Thus, while the cultural logic is altered, the underlying structure remains the same as in the incipient forms of capitalism. This is reflective of the Marxian framework. Jameson sees the postmodern situation as processing both positive and negative aspects of postmodernism. Thus, there is progress and growth side by side. Thus, according to Jameson, there are three stages in the modern progress of capitalism. The first is market capitalism, typified by the national markets. How following this phase comes the imperialist stage, which is backed up by a global capitalistic network. Then the third phase is late capitalism. Share capital is used to commodify new areas. The effect of changes in the economic structure of economically create appropriate cultural changes. automatically create appropriate cultural changes. Thus, Jameson pointed out that we can see that realistic culture is associated with market capitalism, modernist culture is associated with monopoly capitalism, postmodern culture and multinational capitalism. Box 31.3 Late Capitalism. Aesthetic production today has become integrated into the commodity production. Generally, the frantic economic urgency of producing fresh ways of ever more moral seeming goods, from clothing to aeroplanes, at ever greater rates of turnover, now assigns an increasingly essential structural functions and positions to aesthetic innovation and experimentation. Such economic necessities then find recognition in the institutional support of all kinds available for art, from foundation and grants to museums and other forms of patronage. Jameson's perspective works mainly within a base and a superstructural model. According to Jameson, postmodern society has some characteristic. Firstly, there is superficiality, in the sense the cultural products keeps to superficiality and do not inquire deep into the situation. Example, the soap cans can portray the Marilyn Monroe, both of which are similar as they are a copy of a copy. Both paintings were painted from a copy of the photographs. Thus, the pictures are simulacrum, in which one cannot distinguish the original from the copy. These paintings are simulacrum and lack in depth, and covers the surface meaning original only. Further emotions or emotionality is hardly to be found in the postmodern societies. Thus, alienation has been supplanted by fragmentations, which results in the impersonalizations of interaction. Again, that thirdly, historically is set aside, and it is clear that all that can be known about the past is textual and can spawn intertextuality at the most. What this implies is that the postmodernists do not restrict themselves to a single linear past, but pick and choose from among the available styles. This is to say, there is a strong element of pastiche. This implies that truth about past history is that we have no way of knowing what happened. The historians then have to be satisfied with a pastiche which is itself may not be reflect much of past reality, and there is no such thing as linear historical development. Finally, postmodernism has a new technology available to it, especially the computer and other electronic machines not present earlier. What we can say then is that the postmodern societies are in deep flux and great confusion, and many symptoms of this have appeared, especially when regard to certain kinds of affliction. Thus, whole new breeds of psychiatrists are busy trying to undo the stress and tensions that postmodernism is clearly associated with. Thus, there is a problem of chaotic and disturbing trends of late capitalism. It is difficult to cope with the multinational economy and according to cultural impact and consumerism. Jameson feels that cognitive maps are needed to deal with postmodern realities. The maps can be put together by artists, novelists, and working people. Thus, Jameson's schema tries to build bridges between Marxian theory and postmodernism, but ends up antagonizing both Marxist and postmodernist. This was to be expected because, despite Jameson's efforts to synthesize, it was clear that a grand theory meta-narrative was unlikely to be bent backwards, and therefore Jameson used mainly its base superstructure dichotomy. Jameson's postmodernism tries to maintain some basic tenuous link with Marxian theory, despite the fact that the Marxian is a grand narrative. However, in the case of Jean Baudrillard, postmodernism journey of ideas commences in the 1960s when he started out. In case of John Baudrillard, postmodernism is presented as a maverick social theory of contemporary times. Thus, Baudrillard's journey of ideas commences in the 1960s when he started out as a Marxist critic of consumer society. He was influenced by both linguistics and semiotics. However, he soon left this orientation behind him and abandoned both Marxism and structuralism. 31.8 Baudrillard and postmodernism. In the 1970s, Baudrillard alleged that Marx and their detractors both had a similar view or orientations, which was conservative. He felt that an alternative explanation was necessary. Thus, Baudrillard put forward the notion of symbolic exchange as an alternative to economic exchange. Symbolic exchange itself involves a continuous process of a gift giving and gift taking. It is clear that the symbolic exchange was beyond and opposed to the logic of late capitalism. Such a symbolic exchange implied the creation of a society based on the same, but Baudrillard choose to be a political. He studied contemporary society and saw that it is not production but the electronic media that characteristic it. Example, TV, computers, satellites. We have moved from societies under different modern modes of productions to a society that is more involved with the code of production. Exploitations and profit motives have given way to a domination by the science system that produced them. Again, science referred to something else, but in postmodern society, they become self-referential and characterized by simulations and simulacra, which are representations of any aspect of conception. From Baudrillard, the most modern world is hyper reality. Thus, media becomes more real than the reality itself and provides news, views, and events in an exaggerated, skewed, and even ideological manner. Thus, the term hyper-reality. This is not without consequences, as the real tends to be buried in the hyper-real and may ultimately be banished together. Box 31.4 Catastrophe Management. In short, there is such distortions between North and South to the symbolic advantage of the South that one day everything will break down. One day the West will break down if we are not soon washed clean of this shame, if an international congress of the poor countries does not very quickly decide to share out this symbolic privilege of misery and catastrophe. For Baudrillard, culture is undergoing a very deep change, which makes the masses more and more passive rather than increasingly rebellious. Thus, the mass encounter these changes with seeming ease, absorbing each new cultural idea or artifact. Thus, for Baudrillard, masses are not seen to be the products of media. Rather, it is the media which is absorbed to provide these wants to the masses for objects and or entertainment. For Baudrillard, society is in theories of a death culture. Thus, it is death anxiety that pushes people to try and lose their anxiety by using and abusing the consumerist culture. There is no revolutionary silver lining to Baudrillard's theory, and the problem is also that symbolic exchange societies may exist, but how to bring them about is not addressed by Baudrillard. All in all, Baudrillard's brilliant and unusual ideas make it a clear breakaway from the ideas and artifacts of modernism. Baudrillard is in Deconstructing Contemporary Society shows just how much sociological theory has moved forward and away from classical thought. Thus, we can see postmodernism does display certain characteristics, and we can see below just what these are. The first of these characteristics is that in postmodernism, that is a multiplicity of views, meanings, and so on. Secondly, on the postmodernists are looking for polysemic and alternative meanings. Thirdly, there is a distrust of meta-narratives and grand narratives as found in classical sociological theory. It also holds that since there are a multiplicity of perspectives, there will always be many truths. Thus, postmodernists regard concepts, ideas, and texts which are open to interpretations. They also look for binary positions in the text. Further, these binary positions are themselves shown to be false or at least not necessarily true. Finally, the postmodernists identify text groups which are absent or omitted. This is regarded important to any deconstruction. Now, postmodernism is reflected in almost all areas of life, including film, TV, literature, etc., which are deeply influenced by postmodern viewpoints. Let us now turn to some postmodern aspects visible in other fields. Thus, in language, word and forms are used, and the concept of play is basic to it. Thus, play implies altering the frame which connects ideas, allowing dropping of a metaphor. Thus, the text has a meaning which is understood or interpreted by the reader and not the author. This play or exercise is the way that the author gains some significance in the consciousness of the reader. The problem with this postmodern views about language is very difficult to understand and is against the basics of communications, where the author communicates to the reader in a lucid manner as possible. In literature, it's found that postmodern works is not so much opposed modernist literature. Instead, it tends to extend it stylistically. Some postmodern literatures include David Foster Wallace and Thomas Pynchon, both of whom are critical of the vast system building in the end of the Enlightenment modernity. As you would have noticed, post-structuralism and postmodernism do have an intermission quality. Indeed, some others straddle both fields. Example, Francois Lyotard. Further, structuralism tries to build models seeking out factor, and patterns that are stable, which is anathema to postmodernists and rejected outright as a fertile maneuver. Thus, postmodernism has retained the cultural dimensions of structuralism but has rejected the claims to its scientificity. Again, post-structuralism is a position in philosophy. It is not the name of an era, whereas postmodernism is associated with the postmodern epoch. 31.9 Conclusion. What then has postmodernism achieved? The answer is that postmodernism has turned away the shroud over the analysis and demystified both epistemological and ideological constructs. Further, a deep look at the ethnography has led to a re-examination and questioning of ethnography itself. Postmodernism and its adherents points out the sociology should analyze the role of their own culture in the study of culture and therefore increase the sensitivity of the subject. Postmodern approaches have been criticized on several grounds. To begin with, postmodernism are against theory. This is paradoxical since this is itself a theoretical positions taken by the postmodernists. Again, the postmodernists emphasize the illogical or non-rational aspects of a culture. Further, the postmodern concentrates on the marginal, which is itself evaluative. Then again, the stress of intertextuality, but do not always follow their own advice and often treat texts as standing alone. Postmodernists also put away all assessment of theory, but this does not mean that there is no means of assessment. Thus, according to postmodernists, modernism is inconsistent, but they themselves exercise it as which way they want. Finally, the postmodernists are self-contradictory when they deny any claims of reality or truth in their own writings. Finally, there is the issue of postmodernism not having any confidence in the scientific method. But if sociology does allow this position, then it will turn into a study of meaning rather than causes, which influence what it is to be an individual in society. 31.10 further readings. Baudrillard, G. 1976, Symbolic Exchange and Death. Then Writing and Difference, Chicago, University of Chicago Press. Then again for Foucalt, The Archaeology of Knowledge and the Discourse on Language, from Jameson, Postmodern, or The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. So this is the end of unit 31, post-structuralism and postmodernism. Thank you very much.